You're welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. With the downstream sector of Nigeria's petroleum industry still in a state of flux following months and months of dispute between state-owned oil corporation, the Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited, and Dangote Refinery, news emerged this week that NNPCL, in cahoot with a few oil marketers, had imported about 200 million litres of petrol over a 12-day period, spanning February 1st and February the 12th, 2025. This, according to reports, happened in spite of improved refining capacity at home in the wake of the refurbishment of the Warri and Kaduna refineries. Who's saying the truth and who is not? And what can be done to turn the table against the political and economic circumstances fueling what many have compared to shooting oneself in the foot? For a bit of focus on all of that, we're now being joined by Economist and energy expert Kelvin Emmanuel. Good morning and a pleasure to see you again on the morning show, Kelvin.
Good morning, Steve. Thank you so much for having me. It's a privilege to be here.
All right. Good morning. Let's dive straight into it. I mean, this is a subject that you are quite familiar with. And I know that at some point you did discuss the surprising move of the huge number or huge volume of fuel that was being imported, that were actually imported in the last quarter of 2024, between October and December. But then this week, the news is out that it hasn't stopped, that in the first 12 days of February alone, more than 400 billion naira has been committed, to further importation of fuel by the NNPC, apparently together with a few independent marketers. That's in addition to the more than 5 trillion expended in the last quarter of last year. What is your understanding of what is going on? A lot of people will say that Dangote Refinery is there. A few other refineries in Nigeria are also there, making little supplies. And what the PIA clearly stipulates is that once there is a refining capacity, NNPCL is bound to give encouragement, to such local capacity. But here we are, spending money, importing fuel, and then we are still saying that we have revived 2 of the 4 state-owned refineries in Warri and in Port Harcourt. What is your understanding of all this? Is it confusing to you as it is to me, or there's something that is not clear to the average Nigerian?
Steve, very, very, very important question you asked. As a matter of fact, I will tell you that in this lawsuit, the Dangote, opened against the NMDPRA in interpretation of sections 317 subsections 7 to 9 of the Petroleum Industry Act, as signed in August of 2021. FCCPC joined in defense of NMDPRA, saying that there is no issue around the regulator not complying with the law. And it's interesting FCCPC would do that because when you consider the fact, for example, that a lot of the petrol imported into Nigeria are mid-grade petrol, Afri-1 petrol, with sulfur level that are over 750, some of them are over 1,000 ppm. And when you burn them, the ash content is usually very black. You don't get white smoke, which is what you're supposed to get if you're, bringing in petrol with very high octane rating and a proper right vapor pressure, RVP, and a proper sulfur level. And the sulfur level, as stated by sections 317 of the subsections 11 of the PIA, is supposed to be 50 ppm. When that convention was passed, when that law was passed, communique was issued by ECOWAS in 2020, February 2020, they agreed on 50, NMDPI revised it to 200 and put an allowable limit of December 31, 2024. Since this year started, NMDPI has now advised on a new allowable limit, which means that it's back to 50 ppm. So if you consider the fact that since October 1, 2024 till date, I'll tell you that we've seen anywhere around 4.5 billion liters of PMS imported into Nigeria. This month alone, NNPC actually imported in the 12 days from February 1 until February 12th, motor tanker vehicle, a vessel report shows that NNPC brought in 213.2 million liters and not 200 million liters of PMS, of a total of about 327 million liters that was brought in the last 12 days from February 1 to February 12th. And it beggars the question that how do you claim that you have Eleme working, Warri working, and then Kaduna is going to come on stream, 110,000 barrels processing capacity per day. You also have to consider the fact, Steve, that, listen, one of the crude distillation units in Kaduna actually cannot process any of the 34 blends of Nigerian crude. And it can only process foreign-grade crude, heavy crude with API degree of less than 26.6 degrees. How are you still importing PMS into Nigeria if the refineries you claim are working are working? And this doesn't, take away from the fact, Steve, that, for those turnaround maintainers, the structure for financing after FEC awarded a letter in 2020 was them pledging Nigeria's crude oil for cash, upfront cash. The government didn't have money to give them. They borrowed $2.4 billion US to do turnaround maintenance within the last 6 years. And it just shows you that somebody is not telling the truth. And the only person who is actually refining crude oil into PMS with acceptable standards, because you can see with the export of products to different parts of the world, is Dangote. That's just the truth, point blank.
All right, let me come in here and talk about the transparency and accountability in this fuel importation that we're seeing. Over 400 billion spent in just 12 days on imported petroleum products, and it's raising, serious concerns about government spending priorities. How transparent is the NNPCL's decision-making process regarding this importation, and who ultimately benefits from this seemingly inefficient model? Private marketers, government officials, or these foreign refineries? Now, that's one. In light of the fact that these imports include approximately 213 million liters of petrol and 104.8 million liters of diesel, like you rightfully said, with all our local refineries that are supposed to be set up, what are the potential macroeconomic implications for Nigeria's trade balance and our foreign exchange reserves when juxtaposed with the reported capacity of our local refineries?
Shayiton, good morning. Thank you very much for a very, very important question you've asked. I talked about AFRI-1 grade of PMS that is being imported. It's a very low-grade PMS with very high sulfur level, very low octane rating. I'll refer you back to the first quarter in 2022, when petrol that had very low octane rating and meet up with what they call the anti-knocking ratio actually came in, and people's engines knocked in different parts of Nigeria, and they didn't get any compensation, and there was no class action suit against the federal government for that. I'll refer you back to it to explain to you the low quality petrol that is brought into Nigeria at a very cheap price. So, for example, there has been no process audits, forensic audit into the grade of petrol and the price of the petrol, because, petrol runs on a global Platts system, and different grades of petrol based on your octane and your sulfur level has different prices. So when you bring in petrol that is either AFRI-1 or falls below AFRI-1, the price is not the same with the premium grade at unleaded 10 ppm or ultra low sulfur diesel, USLD 590, or EN 950, for example, for Jet A1. The prices are not the same, which means that if, for example, your price is far lower than the premium grade petrol that Dangote is pricing at 890 per liter X-Gate, for example, you're making a lot of money from the difference between that discount and the price of the market in Nigeria. And the regulator, NMDPRA, which is supposed to be involved and enforce these pricing framework and mechanisms as stated in Petroleum Industry Act sections 205 and 206 and some other areas of the PIA, is not doing its job. On the question you've asked about the impact of, this importation, despite the fact that Dangote is currently at, macroeconomic impact is currently at 550,000 barrels capacity. And I expect that by either the first or second week of March, it's going to hit 650,000 barrels capacity, despite the fact that it's getting only 61,000, 290,000 barrels per day of crude from NNPC, contrary to the claims that the government has, on that Naira-based crude oil swap. Yeah, Dangote has the capacity to supply the entire Nigerian market with PMS, diesel, Jet A1, at full capacity because it's doing yields of around 53 to 57%, compared to NNPC that is doing yields of about 18%. He can do 57 million liters of PMS per day, 27 million liters of diesel, and 20 million liters of Jet A1. Okay? So when you keep exchanging Nigeria's crude in vendor financing program, in swap, you deny the government of the revenues they're supposed to get to finance the budget. And you can see in 2025, the assumptions, 15.8 trillion will go into debt servicing. The government plans to borrow 13 trillion naira. I've seen some people say, oh, the naira has been appreciating and gaining because of macroeconomic reform, and that cannot be further from the truth, because I can tell you categorically that the gains you've seen in the naira is caused by hedge funds who placed bets recently, who went long on the naira against the US dollar in a couple of billions of dollars. It's speculation. It has nothing to do with the fundamentals. Because if the fundamentals are actually kicking, the naira should be dropping with where we are currently. So if you're not getting FX from the NNPC, which is the major government-owned enterprise that's supposed to be supplying FX for the CBN to do balance of payments, and for you to be able to raise your net asset ratio for your net external reserves and stabilize the naira to reduce inflation, because inflation that is currently at 34.8% has a strong root and foundation in the exchange rate. Okay, there isn't much you can do in a 2025 budget. All right, the president raised the 2025 budget to 54.8 trillion, but the question is not raising the budget. The question is, how do you mobilize for revenue generation? Your tax to GDP ratio, your non-tax to GDP ratio. The elephant in the room is the fact that NNPC has seriously underperformed in terms of how much crude oil it lifts, how much of that crude oil it lifts actually doesn't go to repaying debt through forward sale agreements that are structured. From 2019 to date, NNPC has structured $14 billion in FSAs, okay, and is still planning to structure more, which means that it's committed more than 300 million barrels of Nigeria's crude to paying international creditors for financialization of Nigeria's oil output. And contrary to the claims that the government is making that Nigeria is doing 1.7 million per barrels per day in crude oil out, Nigeria is not doing 1.7 million barrels because OPEC doesn't count natural gas liquids or condensates as part of Nigeria's daily output. Nigeria is actually at 1.53 million barrels per day. And I can tell you that not up to 200,000 barrels of that is actually unencumbered for them to supply Dangote, which speaks to the failure of not just NNPC or the federal government to plan on how to increase production, on how to stop using crude oil swaps and forward sales to structure either their E&P operations or deficits in the budget, and liberalize the market, the midstream and downstream markets for oil and gas in Nigeria.
Thank you, Kelvin. Now, you have just been talking actually mostly about our upstream, how much, how many barrels per day we're doing, the crude credit swaps, whether the crude is encumbered or not. But that's the upstream. But right now, we're focusing on the downstream sector of Nigeria's petroleum sector, particularly the marketers. Now, when it comes to meeting Nigeria's need, Petroleum has said that their focus is on meeting Nigerians' needs, and they're going to lift this petrol or the PMS from wherever they can. I have two questions here. Are we in a position where Dangote can meet Nigeria's needs completely? And is that even energy safe for our needs to be met from one private individual? And secondly, if the products coming from Dangote Refinery, as you've said, where I think it's jet fuel that that Dangote has been able to export to Saudi Aramco. Now, if that's the thing, that the quality is so high, which is why it's higher priced, is Dangote Refinery going to focus mostly on exports? Would that be a better avenue for him to earn forex from places like Saudi than to sell in the Nigerian market?
Adeshua, thank you very much for the question you've asked. So I'll tell you that if Dangote is doing anywhere between 53 and 57% yield for PMS, because the refinery is actually emphasizing why transportation fuels, They're doing PMS, they're doing ultra-low sulfur diesel, AGO, they're doing Jet A1, they're doing carbon black, polypropylene crystals, they're doing residual fuel oils. And I'm sure that before the year runs out, they might start producing base oil, I'm not sure. Right now, as we speak, is doing well over 42 million liters of PMS per day, well over. And I can tell you that, Adeshua, based on real empirical evidence and data, Nigeria doesn't consume more than 32 million liters of PMS per day. If the government claims otherwise, let them provide empirical evidence to prove that Nigeria consumes more than that. They don't. Okay? Then on the issue of Saudi Aramco, Saudi recently ordered for 130 million liters of Jet A1. Outside the fact that EN 950 spec for Jet A1, which is globally recognized, in the petroleum markets. Saudi Aramco has a trading arm called Aramco Trading that trades around the world. They trade LNG, they trade LPG, they trade crude oil. They even trade West African WAF crude blends, So it's the trading arm of Aramco that actually ordered for 130 million liters of EN 950 Jet A1 to trade around the world. Okay? It speaks to the quality. I've always said this, listen, Dangote is the only refinery in Nigeria that has products that are benchmarked and accepted by regulators all over the world. And the fact that Aramco will, import products from Nigeria shows you that, the product meets acceptable standards all over the world. Okay? On the issue of PMS pricing, I'm not sure I got your question exactly. Do you mind refreshing me?
Well, I said that, the prices, if they're competitive worldwide because of how valuable or the quality of Dangote PMS, then wouldn't it, as a private individual, wouldn't he then just be exporting it rather than focusing on Nigeria's markets?
Well, okay, I thought I heard you earlier talk about the fears of, monopoly. And this is a question that has come over and over again. I'll tell you this. The PMS pricing framework is transparent. There is a Platts system of pricing that over 825 refineries around the world are connected to. It's a global pricing system. It's just like LNG has a global pricing system. It's the same benchmark all over the world. That's the system that Dangote uses, okay? And I'll tell you that even at that, he's still bending over backwards, because if he was going to follow global benchmarks and price based on US dollar benchmarks, the price of PMS in Nigeria will be actually over 1,000 naira per liter, but it's at 890 naira per liter. Now, outside of the Platts pricing system, there are other charges. Okay, there's the vessel cost if you're taken by vessel. There is the demurrage cost. There is the throughput cost. And the reason why you have all this cost is because Nigeria doesn't have evacuation infrastructure for taking PMS from refinery out of the refinery. And this is why I said last year that the government didn't plan for Dangote to succeed. And I say that unequivocally. I say that like with my chest, that the Nigerian government actually didn't plan for it to succeed, because the distribution pipeline infrastructure, if the government was being serious, would have been fixed by them holding NMDPRA and taking the bridging allowances it collected for many years before it was collapsed into NMDPRA. And then now the levies it collects per liter, about 9 naira per liter, I'm not sure, into a bridging fund, an infrastructure fund that is not managed by the regulator, but that is, warehoused maybe by a pension fund administrator, a PFA. You can use that money to repair, maintain, and manage the pipeline infrastructure to 22 depots around Nigeria. The cost of transportation of PMS is anywhere between 100 naira and 130 naira per liter. And Dangote is providing a bridging allowances as a private individual to the partners he has, MRS, Adover, and Hayden, I think, which he's having to absorb as a refinery, which is not supposed to be his headache, because a refinery, as soon as he gets out of his gate, whatever happens after that is not his business, because it's not in downstream. Okay, so he's doing what the government is supposed to do in terms of equalization, in terms of the lack of infrastructure that should go into distributing PMS around Nigeria. On the ex-gate price, right, is following the global benchmark. But even at that global benchmark, he's not pricing his products in USD like he should, which means that he will get more value exporting products out of Nigeria than he will get selling to Nigeria, yet he's selling to Nigeria.
All right, that's clear enough. But then, where does this lead us, given that there's a legal dispute, already between Dangote, and NNPCL? What do you think that that will address, and how fast will that happen? And then, secondly, this is something that the NNPC is always reluctant to talk about. For the independent marketers, I can understand that they may not feel obliged to full disclosure. But then when it comes to NNPCL, which is state-owned, we don't get to know what they are doing. We don't have a fair idea, as citizens, as media, as to the actual capacity of the refineries that they claimed are working. In all this, what sort of intervention do you think that both the Minister of Petroleum for State and the President, who of course is the Minister, for Petroleum, what sort of intervention do you think that they should be providing at this point that a lot of Nigerians, will be worried at the amount of money being spent by NNPCL on fuel importation?
Steve, very important question you've asked. First of all, I'll tell you that NNPC needs a complete overhaul. I'll break it down a little bit. First of all, I think the president needs to fire the entire management and board of NNPC, replace them with a new management because they failed. He also needs to replace the mid and downstream regulator management because they failed in their duty, and it's very obvious over the last several months that they failed in their duty. The NNPC has to be restructured. A FEC memo should be released by Federal Executive Council, giving the Minister of Finance the power to execute unbundling of NNPC to the markets. I always say that until you stop the interference between the State House and TOAS, nothing will change at NNPC, even if it gets new group CEO or chairman of the board. Okay? NNPC needs to get out of the business of refining and owning petrol stations that adds little or nothing to its bottom line. NNPC's yield on PMS, for what I classify as blending, because it doesn't have a catalytic reforming unit to actually process naphtha into PMS, and it cannot recover petroleum gases. It's actually 18% compared to 53 to 57% that Dangote is doing in Lagos. Okay? The vertical monopoly NNPC runs simply means that they are taking revenues from upstream, which belongs to the federal government of Nigeria. And this is the reason I've asked that state governors actually test the law in the Supreme Court and sue the federal government for having an agent of government that's inefficient and wasting the resources of the federal federating units, the federal government of Nigeria, which is made up of the federal government, the state governments, and the local governments. Okay? The vertical monopoly runs where it takes revenues from upstream and it subsidizes revenues operations in its midstream and downstream operations, and it has little or nothing to remit to the federal government of Nigeria to fund its budget, is actually affecting the lives of Nigerians, because it's from there you have deficits, from there you have abuse of ways and means, it's from there you have all the forced sale agreement that has been done, including the $3.4 billion for Project Gazelle, where they staked 164 million barrels of crude. This resource-based lending is not a structure that has worked for Nigeria. And you can trace the history of resource-based lending, Duke Oil, NNPC trading, to when MFLA actually started ways and means abuse in 2019, and how it spiraled about 22 trillion naira of ways and means between 2019 and 2022, and how that impacted on the currency. Around the same time when they started ways and means abuse, because NNPC was not remitting monies, and they started forced sale agreements, you can see that naira dropped from 365, it dropped to over 700, and it has continued. Because CBN today doesn't have up to $10 billion as net assets ratio in their net external reserves to do balance of payment and stabilize the currency, which is one of the 5 mandates of the Central Bank of Nigeria. And that has spiraled into the exchange rate. It has spiraled into inflation. It has spiraled into interest rates. And it has spiraled into the GDP per capita, which has dropped from over $2,000 to below $1,000, about $890, if I'm not mistaken. So you need a complete transformation of NNPC. You need an unbundling of it to the market for IPO. You need to restructure the system you have upstream from the UJVs and PSCs to IJVC to create more transparency, to engender, investments coming. There is a lot I can, because there are lots of moving parts, but the foundational step to actually changing the tide from the calamity that we're experiencing today, is for the president to hand off control of the corporation and for the State House to give effect memo for the Minister of Finance to start the unbundling of NNPC to the market. So the point where it's the market that will determine the management and the board. I maintain, and I've always said this, the current management of NNPC Group, the current management of NMDPRA, they lack the wherewithal to manage those corporations and the regulator. And they failed woefully.
All right, maybe the president doesn't think like that, but of course, let's see what happens, given the preponderance of opinion around the performance of the leadership of the NNPC. But Kelvin, we want to thank you so much for joining us on the morning show today. Thanks for your insight and, of course, the brilliant submissions. Thank you indeed.